Fel pawb, good afternoon everyone. I'm very pleased to be speaking to you today on International Women's Day. We've seen over the last year how science and technology are so important in meeting global challenges, and I'm so proud to see so many women in the fields of science and medicine spearheading the fight against COVID-19. Not to mention the thousands of inspirational women teachers, teaching assistants, school and college support staff, and all the other women in our education family who are inspiring the next generation of young women and men. It's also been wonderful to see our youngest learners back in the classroom with their friends over the last 2 weeks, and vocational learners starting to return to their colleges. Next week, we will see the rest of our primary school pupils return to school, as well as groups of learners in secondary and more college students. Schools will also have the flexibility to bring in pupils in years 10 and 12 to support them to progress to the next stages of their learning. And we're also giving schools additional flexibility so that learners in year 7, 8 and 9 are given the opportunity to check in and spend some valuable time in school with their teachers, reacquainting themselves with that environment. It is still my expectation that, if the conditions allow, we would see a full return of all learners after the Easter break. Now, we all know that it's been a tough 12 months for our young people, being away from their friends and adjusting to studying at home. And I have seen terrific work that schools and colleges have done to ensure that learning has continued, while putting in place preparations so that the return of learners is safe and the return to the classroom is as smooth as possible. And I'm so very grateful for school, college and local authority staff for also embracing the testing programme in our schools. By the end of this week, more than 5.5 million lateral flow tests will have been distributed to schools, colleges and childcare settings across Wales, which will be an important measure to provide further assurance at this time. But I also know that extra help is needed this year, especially for learners at key stages in their academic careers and indeed their lives. Last summer, I announced an extra £29 million to recruit, recover and raise standards. I set a target to recruit an additional 900 teachers or teaching assistants to provide more support for learners during the pandemic. And I'm pleased to report that so far, the equivalent of 1,800 full-time staff members have been recruited, double to our original target. But today, I can confirm that this support will go even further, as I'm announcing today an extra £72 million to ensure our schools our settings get the support that they need. This takes our support for learning recovery to over £112 million during the pandemic. And our qualification years are due to receive bespoke support in the coming months to provide them with confidence to move forward in their next steps. Funding will also be used so that trainee teachers can complete their practical experience this autumn, therefore qualifying and moving into full-time teaching. Strengthening our workforce even further during the pandemic is vital, as work continues with the introduction of our groundbreaking new curriculum. Tomorrow is another significant milestone in our national mission, as curriculum and assessment bill reaches its final stages before being passed into law. I call it a national mission because it has involved everyone working together: teachers, parents, academics, businesses, national organisations, and of course my department here in the Welsh Government. All committed to raising standards, tackling the attainment gap, to ensure that we have an education system that is a source of pride to us all. So, it's a massive diolch yn fawr to everyone who has played their part in this historic journey for education in Wales. Thank you. We'll now take questions from our colleagues in the media, and we're going to begin this afternoon with Bethan Lewis over at the BBC. Good afternoon, Bethan.
Good afternoon, Minister. In England, school pupils of all ages are going back full-time this week. Do you regret that that won't be the case for Welsh pupils for at least another month? Also, if you could give a few more details, please, about how the catch-up funding will be spent.
Of course. Well, Bethan, I'm delighted to see children returning to education in any jurisdiction. And as I said in my opening statements, it's been wonderful over the last 2 weeks to see Wales's youngest learners back in school, working with their teachers and being with their friends. And we'll see more children back next week. What's really important to remember is that back in February, SAGE were very clear in their advice to governments that a phased return to school was critically important in being able to monitor the impact on the pandemic as we move forward. And that's what we've been doing here in Wales. Thanks to the hard work of the Welsh public, we were able to announce last week that we could go further than we'd initially hoped for, therefore allowing check-ins for our younger secondary school pupils. And I'm very grateful for those continued efforts that the Welsh public is making. And as I said, in following the advice of SAGE and experts here in Wales, we can make that return as successful and safe as possible. With regards to the additional funding, Bethan, this will allow us to be able to continue to support additional staff in our schools, which is vitally important at this time for a further academic year. We also recognise the real challenges that there have been for those undertaking initial teacher education this year, which of course requires those students to undertake a number of practical hours in a school placement, which through no fault of their own hasn't been possible. And we don't want to lose those valuable, inspirational individuals to our education system. So this funding will be used to ensure that during the autumn term they can be working with our children in our schools and completing their qualifications. We'll also be using the resources to design and to further support those children in critical transition years so that their move from high school perhaps into college or from college or schools to university is as successful as we would all want it to be.
Thank you. Could you say a bit about how the COVID testing for older pupils will work when they hopefully go back from next week? Are you guaranteeing that all pupils in years 10 to 13 will be offered these 2 home testing kits a week? And how much take-up are you expecting?
Well, Bethan, we are confident that the testing kits that will be required will be distributed to our settings. We would encourage parents and students to undertake these tests at home, giving them greater levels of assurance. It's not mandatory, and students will be able to access education without taking the tests. But throughout this pandemic, the Welsh public has shown an absolute determination to do everything that they can to keep themselves, their loved ones and their communities safe. And I'm really hopeful that parents and students themselves will see this as another way and another expression of their commitment to tackling this disease by undertaking these tests, keeping themselves, their colleagues and their community safe. Can we now go to Adrian Masters at ITV Wales? Good afternoon, Adrian.
Good afternoon, Minister. Thank you very much. You've said several times that you're considering catch-up plans for students. There seems to have been a bit more detail emerge about plans in England, which is looking at shorter holidays and longer days. Is that the sort of thing that parents and students here in Wales can expect?
Well, Adrian, our catch-up plans are centred on the ability to resource our schools with the additional staff and expertise to allow them to do what they do best. All children have suffered an interruption to their learning, but our teachers are well versed and understand exactly what they need to do to ensure that learners can progress. And what's really important is that the money we're announcing today will allow head teachers to put that support into place. Prior to the pandemic, Welsh Government did undertake a piece of work entitled Reimagining the School Day. COVID-19, I think, have brought to the fore again questions about whether our academic year and our school days are designed to fit a modern society. And I think there is a debate to be had. But Adrian, what's really important is that we, if I can misquote Yeats, is that we remember that education isn't about filling a pail, it's about lighting a fire underneath it. And we need to resource our schools to do that. Simply piling more pressure onto our children and young people and onto our teaching profession, I don't think we'll get it all want to be. But having said that, I'm delighted, for instance, that our very successful food and fun programme that runs in the summer holiday for primary school pupils, we've been able to double the amount of funding going into that programme this summer so that even more children can benefit from those really wonderful activities based around the arts and physical fitness and cooking, so that more children can benefit this summer than we have previously. We are developing, alongside our teaching professionals, a comprehensive support programme to ensure that our children move forward with confidence. A constant discussion about a deficit model, that somehow all is lost, is not one that will help our children. Our professionals and the Welsh Government stand ready to instigate a plan that will ensure that we can move forward with confidence.
Thank you. And talking of food and students, do you think the Welsh Government should go further on free school meals? According to People's Assembly, more than half of children in poverty here aren't eligible for free school meals. Will you commit to making sure they are?
Adrian, Wales was the first of the devolved nations to commit to ensuring that those children in receipt of free school meals during term time got that help during the holidays. And I just want to say thank you to our partners in local government that have been able to seamlessly deliver that support for our families that are most in need. And indeed, we are committed to funding that support right the way through to Easter of next year. With regards to making additional families eligible for free school meals, the Welsh Government is and has publicly said on a number of occasions that we are committed to reviewing eligibility, especially with regards to the impact of universal credit. But let's be absolutely clear. As I said, we are funding free school meals for those that are entitled for the following year. And of course, uniquely in Wales, when our schools are available for face-to-face learning, we uniquely have comprehensive breakfast provision also. And I'm also delighted that this year we have been able to double our investment into our PDG Access Fund. Again, these are funds available to our poorest families to help with the costs of the school day, whether that be items of uniform or kit, equipment, or even this year IT. And I would ask families who think that they may be eligible to check on the Welsh Government or with their local authority about eligibility criteria for gaining support under this particular grant scheme.
Thank you.
Hannah Thomas at LBC. Hello, Hannah.
Thank you, Education Minister. Welsh Government have said they are prioritising children getting back to face-to-face learning for their education. But we've been speaking to a baby group leader who says they haven't yet been given a date. They're concerned babies are missing out on vital socialisation skills in their early years, not to mention mums and dads, particularly first-time mums and dads, say they're feeling very isolated without being able to develop these social network groups. Will baby groups be given a date when they can reopen soon?
I absolutely take your point, Hannah, that for those families for whom their children haven't yet reached nursery age or statutory school age, this is a period of concern. And I know that those groups play a really important role in supporting new parents and the early development of babies. And Welsh Government will continue, as we look at our next review period, at what steps we can take to safely unlock the restrictions that we're under. But I can assure you that in all of those discussions, the needs of children and young people are paramount.
Thank you. And also then, schools in Wales, like you mentioned in your opening statement, have reopened, and we hope that many older students will be heading back to the classroom soon also. But you've also mentioned about the lateral flow testing for years 11 to 13. Are there any plans to open this up to younger years? As we know, they may have the virus but remain asymptomatic, and this may contribute to the spread of the virus. So is that something that Welsh Government is considering?
At this time, we have not been recommended by our scientific advisors that asymptomatic testing of younger children is appropriate. We do know that the epidemiology around the disease in older teenagers is much more similar to that of adults, and that's why we have taken the decision we have around access to lateral flow testing for older students being more appropriate, and we will continue to review the evidence in that regard. It's also important to remember that lateral flow testing twice a week is also available to those working in those school environments. Thank you, Hannah. We'll now go to Will Hayward at Wales Online. Good afternoon, Will.
Good afternoon. Mark Drakeford was on the radio at the weekend saying that the Welsh Government are looking at imposing a stay local restriction after this week. The hospital admissions data shows that admissions are nearly as low now as they ever reached last summer. Cases per 100,000 are now below 50, which according to the Welsh Government's own tiering would put Wales at alert level 1, the very lowest there is. Given all of this, why are you proposing to continue with such severe restrictions on people's liberties after Friday by telling them to stay local? How can you justify this?
Well, can I say you're absolutely right. There is data that we can all be massively encouraged by, but those figures that Will just referred to have been hard won by the Welsh public. And we need to follow the advice that in unlocking restrictions, we do not undo the tremendous hard work of the Welsh public. We want to ensure that when we unlock, we can do that on a permanent basis and not find ourselves in a situation where we will see cases rise quickly again and potentially hospital admissions rise quickly again, and therefore the need to reimpose restrictions. All advice to the Welsh Government is clear. Any unlocking must be done carefully and it must be done cautiously. That will allow us to monitor the impact of community spread. Because even with the vaccination programme, well, I'm sure you understand the science that if we let the virus spread rapidly within the community, even if that leads to less pressure on our NHS, that potentially leads to the situation where we can see the development of new variants. We are at a critical juncture in the management of this pandemic, where there is much to be hopeful and optimistic about, but could so easily be thrown away by an incautious approach to unlocking, where we still have great progress in the vaccination programme, and I think we're going to meet a very significant milestone today in Wales with regards to that vaccination programme, but still significant amounts of our population that haven't been vaccinated, and that provides the perfect opportunity for the emergence of new variants.
Thank you. My question wasn't really about a widespread unlocking. It wasn't suggesting about pubs or restaurants or anything like that. It was simply suggesting that as admissions to hospital are now lower than they've ever been since the start of the crisis, that people might be able to go further from their house than 5 miles. Just moving on from this, does this suggest that the tiering system that the Welsh Government announced back in January is now completely redundant with regards to lifting restrictions? And can you just explain the science behind someone travelling 5 miles to a park or 25 miles to go walking in the Brecon Beacons? Is part of your rationale to stop people travelling into Wales from across the border? Can you just explain the science behind the stay local rules that you're considering?
Well, I think we have to recognise that even within Wales, we still see quite significant differences in the amount of community spread. So if you look, for instance, at Ceredigion and Pembrokeshire, which have very, very low levels, as compared to the figures in parts of North Wales, even within Wales, there is still some considerable difference in those figures, although overall the news is good. Any decision to move from a stay-at-home message to a stay-local message is part of that cautious approach to beginning to unlock measures and doing so in a way where we can monitor the impact of that before moving to the next stage. And as I said, all of the decisions that we are making will be guided by the best advice at this time, but the consistent thread of all advices is that a big bang approach to unlocking measures and having people travel everywhere potentially needs to be factored in and considered, and a cautious approach to unlocking the ability to travel is one I think that is in line with the overall government's approach, especially in those communities, where actually there's a great deal of concern, where we haven't had visitors in the beacons for very many months. Suddenly having an influx of people into some of these areas could cause some concerns in those communities, especially if those communities have been fortunate enough to bring their levels low. So a cautious and gradual approach, I think, is one that throughout this pandemic has been valued by the Welsh public.
So is the tiering system now redundant?
No, well, the tiering system isn't redundant. It is a mechanism by which we can look at different tranches of levels of restrictions. But if you don't mind, well, I'm going to move on to your colleague now at the National. And it's over to Gareth at Axonderry. Good afternoon, Gareth.
Good afternoon, Minister. Your announcement today is expected to increase the spend per pupil equivalent to £239 in Wales. On the ground, can you just give us some examples of how that money will be spent to help the most disadvantaged pupils who've often been the hardest hit over the last 12 months?
Thank you, Gareth. And you're right, whilst all children's education has been interrupted at this time, we do know that there are cohorts of children for whom the effects of the pandemic have been greatest, and those often are some of our most disadvantaged children, or children, for instance, with additional learning needs. The money will be made available to individual school settings for the head teacher to be able to employ additional staff that can help children. So, for instance, last week I was able to visit a school here in Splot in Cardiff, and so far our recruitment money has been able to employ new teaching assistants in the foundation phase that are spending all of their time working on the literacy and the oracy skills of the children. So really working on their speaking skills, their language skills, and their reading skills. In a high school, for instance, I'm aware, for instance, of in one area, they've employed a remote physics teacher and science teacher, and that teacher has been able to provide additional online tutoring sessions to those in exam classes who are taking physics and other science A-levels. I'm aware of another secondary school where they've been able to cut the class sizes of their English language classes because they've been able to employ an additional member of staff. But we do need to give the power to the head teachers to be able to make staffing decisions that really reflect the needs of their individual school. But those are just some examples of the work that is going on in the ground to be able to support children at this time.
Diolch yn fawr. Reform of Wales's education curriculum has been central to your role over the last 5 years. In what way, to you, has the pandemic impacted that work? And how do you hope that new curriculum can address the inequalities in education that have been laid bare over the last 12 months?
Well, you're absolutely right. Curriculum reform has been at the centre of the largest reform programme we've had in education in a generation. And what our curriculum allows us to do is once again trust our teachers in their ability to design a curriculum that really engages the children in front of them, rather than having to teach a curriculum that is set many miles away with no thought about what those children in that class actually needs. So we'll be able to unleash the creativity and the professionalism of our teaching workforce to really design a curriculum that meets the needs of the children sitting in front of them, that engages them, and that lights that fire underneath them that we talked about earlier, that gives them a passion and a love of learning for the rest of their lifetime. And it is particularly important that we do that now, with the strong emphasis in our new curriculum around health and well-being of our learners. You know, we know that learning can't stick unless we address issues around well-being for children and young people. And our new curriculum gives our professionals the space to do just that. Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of today's press conference. Thank you once again for your attention and for all your efforts in keeping Wales safe. Diolch yn fawr.